Hi, yes, my name is Sanford Ikeda. I'm a professor of economics at Purchase College of the State University of New York. Today I'm presenting a paper on Jane Jacobs, on Henry George, and their different views of progress and poverty. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a night of firsts for me. It's the first time I've ever spoken at a Masonic lodge. First time before the Henry George School. I'm very pleased to be here. I have to say something before I talk about the topic of my paper and my talk tonight about how I came to be connected with Henry George, or how this paper that combines these two thinkers came to be. And it was about a year ago that Clifford Cobb of the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, they, as you know, do a lot on Henry George. He asked me if I would write an essay that somehow combined Jacobs and George in any way that I wanted to. And I had to confess to them that I really didn't know very much about Henry George. I knew enough to talk to him, talk about him to a class of undergraduates in my history of economic thought class, and something about, but I can't say that I've made a study of Henry George at all. And so Mr. Cobb was very sympathetic. In fact, he suggested readings that I might look at, and I did. I read Progress and Poverty. About this time last year, I was plowing through Progress and Poverty. I read several other essays that he'd written in various books, including Social Problems and related material. All right, so that's how this came to be written. I do know much more about Jane Jacobs. She's somebody that I have admired and respected for a very long time. And one of the things that I try to do is to integrate her social theory, and in particular her economic theory, into more mainstream, or the kind of economics that I do. Not that Austrian economics is so mainstream, because I do give an Austrian economic interpretation of Jane Jacobs. But I thought her work was important enough and enlightening enough that more economists should be aware of her. And I'm sure those of you who are followers of Henry George feel the same way about Henry George. So anyway, so that's enough background for this. What I'm trying to do in this talk and in this essay is to contrast them. Henry George has an enthusiastic following, obviously, through the Henry George School and elsewhere. His books, Progress and Poverty, is still in print after 100 years or so. Jane Jacobs similarly has a following, largely outside of economics. As I said before, what I trying to do is bring her ideas into economics, but largely outside of economics. But before I talk about the differences, I want to talk about some of the similarities before I talk about the differences. I think in some sense they're both sort of quintessentially American public intellectuals, although they worked almost 100 years apart, not quite. As we know, Henry George is known for his proposals for land tax. And some of you may know, especially if you're from New York City, that Jane Jacobs, they both lived in New York City, that Jane Jacobs is known for her battles against people like Robert Moses and heavy-handed urban planning. But I didn't want to write a paper specifically about that. I kind of wanted to dig a little bit deeper to look at a contrast in terms of how they viewed the nature of economic progress and on the role of cities in that progress. As I'll point out later, those are two areas, I think, of deep difference between them. All right, so the parallels, in addition to the fact that they're both American public intellectuals, they both lived in New York, although they were not born in New York City. They both were highly critical of the economics of their time. Henry George wrote mostly toward the end of what we would call the classical economic era of Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill. Whereas Jane Jacobs, writing again about 100 years later, is writing in the area of sort of the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis and microeconomics. And they both rebelled against that orthodoxy. They were both sympathetic to the free market. There's this remarkable quote that I found from Science of Political Economy. George says that to find a fully civilized people, we must find a people among whom exchange or trade is absolutely free and has reached the fullest development to which human desires can carry it. There is as yet, unfortunately, no such people. All right? Today, so there's an emphasis on the ability of people to cooperate together and to help themselves working together. Both established their scholarly reputations outside of academia, right? Henry George didn't go to, as I understand it, didn't have formal education past the age of 14, which was, I think, not unusual in the mid-19th century. Jacobs graduated, we think, from high school in Scranton, Pennsylvania, came to New York and studied at Columbia University, taking this and that for a couple of years, and then she dropped out. Yet both have became very influential public intellectuals, writing very important books. But again, there are at least two areas. I think there's some fundamental disagreement. One has to do with the nature of progress and poverty, the nature of progress and poverty. The other one is the nature and significance of cities. So those two areas where I think they differ markedly. Okay, so privilege of monopoly ownership of land really is at the center of this. This is what impoverishes workers instead of allowing them to share in the wealth created by free trade. And I just want to show this. Unfortunately, it's cut off at the top, but this is there are two lines here. Looks like an inverted hockey stick. In fact, this is what Deirdre McCloskey calls the inverted hockey stick of economic wealth. The blue line is world population, and then the red line is world per capita GDP, gross domestic product. Right? Gross domestic product is the dollar value of all goods and services produced in one country in a year. Okay, so to the extent that we have statistics about these things, if you go back to the time of Christ, to about 1500, that per capita GDP is at about $1 to $3 per person per day. Okay, from time immemorial, from the time of the first cities, civilization, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago, till about 1500. It's about the same, of $1 to $3 a day. And then around 1500, it starts to rise slightly. Okay, and then also population picks up. So in 1800, there's a real takeoff. Right? You see the hockey stick go up. The red line showing that per capita GDP goes up geometrically at this point. But there's this conundrum for George, right, where he says that he proposes to seek the law which associates poverty with progress and increases want with advancing wealth. So material progress does not merely fail to relieve poverty, it actually produces it. The association of poverty with progress is the great enigma of our time. So again, there's a particular kind of progress that impoverishes. Similarly, there's a different kind of progress, one not connected with private ownership of land, that does not generate this poverty, in which everyone can share in the progress. passage. When land increases in value, it does not mean that its owner has added to the general wealth. The owner may never have seen the land or done aught to improve it. He may, and often does, live in a distant city or in another country, because land value simply means that the owners, by virtue of their appropriation of something that existed before man was, have the power of taking a larger share of the wealth produced by other people's labor. So land is something that exists before man was. It's something that is just there. It objectively exists. Of course, it objectively exists, but the usefulness, the land as a factor of production was always there. And this is very similar to what some popular economists today say about capital. And I'm thinking about Piketty in his book on capital in the 21st century. Right, that capital somehow automatically earns a return to those rich enough to accumulate it. Therefore, Piketty recommends that governments around the world tax all the profits from capital, and that's not going to have any ill effect. Similarly, George believed that taxing what he called the unearned portion of land rent would not only be just, but would eliminate land speculation and raise enough revenue to resolve poverty and a myriad of other social and fiscal problems. He argued that the congestion and filthy conditions of great cities could be traced directly back to the privilege of land ownership, which would disappear with the elimination of land. Okay, so there's this very strong connection between land ownership, cities, and the terrible conditions within cities. Around 1870, the outlook of economic theory began to change very radically. The focus shifted in economic theory toward individual perceptions and expectations, and how these individual expectations and perceptions interacted with other people's perceptions and expectations, and how that interaction generates patterns and outcomes that are typically, though not always, benign. So the shift goes from the objective land rent, labor theory of value, population doctrine, Karl Marx, material factors of production, that sort of objective physical view of the economic reality, to a subjective one, that value depends on the perceptions of individuals. So it's at the same time subjective and individual based, that in order to explain economic phenomena, you have to be able to do it in terms of the decisions and actions of individuals. Okay, that's a momentous shift in economic theory from classical economics to what we might call neoclassical economics. It didn't happen overnight. It started about 1870 and probably was completed by 1910. So that's 30, 40 years. But this was the transition period. There's an economic historian named Myint, and M-Y-I-N-T, who makes this distinction. He calls the classical economists concerned with the physical level. Again, labor theory of value, population doctrine, land rent, material productive forces of society, versus the subjective level, individual expectations, perceptions, and that sort of thing. So to those who frame the problem in the subjective level, and not everybody did in the new 20th century, but to those who did, the solution to the economic problem is that it needs to be in terms of trial and error. That is to say, you have individuals who are not perfectly informed, who make mistakes. So the problem is, how do individuals who are imperfect manage somehow to coordinate their actions to generate success and eventually wealth? Okay, the way that some people might put it is, how does Paris get fed? How do you feed a population of 3 million people without an overall planner? All right, so some within the subjective view of economics looked at trial and error as a natural way of doing this, such that beneficial and orderly consequences of success can stay ahead of the costly and chaotic consequences of error. Right? You have trial and error. It's a messy business. While there are still large social patterns at work here, the starting point of the subjective view of economics is individual action in the face of uncertainty, and the legal and social institutions, the rules of the game, that enable social cooperation. Okay? So you got people who make mistakes. What rules in which they operate, the rules under which they operate will determine largely whether they can cooperate or not. Okay? If the rules of the game say theft is okay, that violent aggression is okay, then you're going to get one outcome. You're probably not going to get a high level of social cooperation. If you have another rule that says that we have individual autonomy, we have private property, and if we want to better ourselves, we have to do it through voluntary exchange, you'll get a different outcome, even though you have the same kinds of imperfect, self-interested people in each case. Okay, so here we get to Jacobs. And she has this rather startling statement in her book, The Economy of Cities, which was published in 1969. She says, poverty has no causes. Poverty has no causes. Only prosperity has causes. So in other words, poverty is for her the default condition of mankind. Right? Unless you have an environment that invites people to take risks, trial and error, to experiment and to innovate, that tolerates failure and tolerates success, you're not going to get progress. Okay? It's inefficient in a sense that, well, if we had perfect knowledge, you wouldn't have to do trial and error. But we don't have perfect knowledge, and so there's no other way to innovate. So while the immediate target of Jacobs' 1961 book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she criticizes urban planning, her immediate target was urban planning, but her real target was the all-knowing attitude that ignored or even failed to see the benign patterns that emerged from sometimes congested street-level actions of ordinary people. She objected to planners who thought they knew what cities should look like and then tried to impose that vision on the citizens of that city without first understanding the nature of a city. That infrastructure of cities that generates innovation includes dynamic social networks. This is all in Jacobs. Social networks, social capital, and trust, which for Jacobs are the foundations of genuine long-term economic development. Safe, lively streets for Jacobs dynamically interact with entrepreneurial trial and error to generate the kind of progress that enables safety, tolerance, diversity, and creativity to flourish. Okay, now there's a lot of people in great cities. Paris at the turn of the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, it was a city of about 3 million people. And London similarly, a city of millions of people, and obviously today much, much larger. Henry George was not alone in criticizing this congestion in cities. But what Jacobs points out is that there are two things going on here which are often confused, kind of mixed up. One is population density, which is simply the number of people in like an acre of land in a city. And that's often confused with overcrowding. And overcrowding is when you have too many people living in a unit. Right? You have, in the old, if you visit the tenement museum, where you have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 families living on a single floor, right? That's overcrowding. But density is simply where you have a lot of people living in a small area. And that can be, that does not necessitate overcrowding. Now, often you see the two things together, but many 19th century observers lump this all into one category of overcrowding. okay, or of congestion. Talk about the congestion of cities, not distinguishing between density without overcrowding on the one hand and density with overcrowding on the other. Is this sort of clear? Okay, so obviously George wrote about progress, but I don't think he appreciated as much as Jacobs did the micro foundations of that progress. I think George understood the importance of individuals and trade and exchange, certainly, but I don't know if I don't think he understood to the same degree Jacobs did of the micro foundations, of the importance of trial and error, of trust in the social institutions that foster those things. And so it's easy to find passages in Henry George which are highly critical of the major cities of his day. He, for example, quotes William Cobbett approvingly. And William Cobbett famously described 19th century London as a great wen, right, a boil on the neck of civilization. And George says, there is truth in such comparison, he asserts. Nothing more clearly shows the unhealthiness of present social tendencies, he says, than the steadily increasing concentration of population in great cities. Just as the wen or tumor drawing on the wholesome juices of the body into the poisonous vortex impoverishes all parts of the frame, so does the crowding of human beings into great cities impoverish human life in the country. So George saw urban concentration, again, not distinguishing overcrowding from density, as driven by private land ownership and speculation, impoverishing both town and country. Now, I've been told that Henry George was not fundamentally anti-city, and I believe that. But I think his own writings suggest to me that George may have had nothing against cities as long as they operated on his terms. And in this respect, he might be compared to other reformers of his day, reformers of cities, and I include Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, and especially Ebenezer Howard.
Thank you for your talk. It's very courageous to give something in an hour. I've read of such depth. I've read Jane Jacobs, a few of her books, and I've read several of Henry George's books, and I'm endeavoring to have other studies. No, but I find it interesting. In particular, I feel I almost have to come to the defense of Ebenezer Howard, because I feel that she was falling a little short on her judgment, particularly because the garden movement was the effect of the injustice of rack rents paid by people, the working class in London, which is a demonstration, I feel, of the taking advantage of the land rent, where people were, particularly the working poor, were living in inhumane conditions. And then, so the Garden City movement was really a result of that condition. And so I think it demonstrates, number one, that even Ebenezer Howard was indeed inspired by Henry George and was dealing with that aspect of it. But I don't believe it shows that he had no interest in or was oblivious to other grander utopic kind of schemes. But when we're dealing with not having our basic needs met, I think that he was dealing with that condition. And so I find I have a little difficulty with that whole judgment of Ebenezer Howard, even though I think he was unsuccessful in the long run, and there's speculation whether that had to do with investors and that they had to make a profit, which brings me to also the free market. And I forget the person's name, but he was the assistant treasurer during the Irish potato famine. And during that condition, when much produce was leaving Ireland, not owned by the Irish whose labor produced it, his comment was that they didn't want to intervene into the free market, and that it was really nature's way of adjusting the Irish population. And what I'm saying is they've already adjusted the free market by making it not a free market, and then wanting to say, well, we don't want to interrupt the free market. And I find a lot of what Jacob was talking about had to do with a point in time or a snapshot in time which didn't take into account conditions before not wanting to intervene with a free market. And so that's what I really wanted to address, but I wanted to lead up to that because I think that poverty had a lot to do with Ebenezer Howard's, and I think that the free market, we must look way before that snapshot in time. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Good observations. I don't know if I can comment intelligently on the whole thing. I kind of like Ebenezer Howard myself. His proposals did not rely on state intervention. This is all was, as you say, a profit-making enterprise, and what he was trying to do, as I understand it, was to sort of expand the idea of what we would call a cooperative building, right? Except on steroids. Right? You'd have, there's a movement of, you wouldn't own, individuals who lived in the Garden City, as I understand it, would not own the property, they would lease it, right? They would own shares in the Garden City, et cetera. And I just think that that's an interesting idea that could work, and it hasn't because it hasn't been implemented fully, but I have a certain sympathy myself for that kind of thing. Well, I think what Jacobs was objecting to was, and I'm sure since you've read Howard, you realize that he had some fairly specific ideas of what should be used for what, and he had sort of a, and this may have been inspired by his revulsion of how things were being done in London, of zoning, right? Clear zones for residential, for manufacturing, and that sort of thing. And we know that for Jacobs, who was not a free market person, right? Not in the sense that I am, let's say, free market person, that she didn't object to zoning. What she objected to was the kind of zoning that was taking place in New York and other places at the time, the sort of Euclidean zoning for use, rather. She thought that zoning should be done for, number one, for scale. You shouldn't have a dominant use in one area. Also, if there's already one gas station, you shouldn't let another gas station and that kind of thing in order to diversify. As far as free trade goes, I don't know if this answers your question, but she, as I said before, was not, I think she was largely free trade, but she did think that under certain circumstances, tariffs and some limited subsidies could generate conditions which would allow free trade to flourish more. Thank you very much for coming.